Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of Outspoken. Carlos started talking, ruined the date.
Sorry.
We're not gonna shoot it again. This is it. We're rolling with this.
Oh man. Okay, this is perfectly. It I think it describes our dynamic perfectly well.
Yeah,
So
100% on brand. So I'd like to introduce everyone who's watching to Carla Gozo. Is a very good friend of mine. I've known her for more than a decade now, and she's also my favorite philosopher journalist. She's going to talk to us about media today. We're gonna have a quick conversation about just why debaters get so many things wrong. I'm kidding, but maybe that is something we should talk about. Oh, hi, Carla. How are you?
I'm great, Kyle. Thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm fine. It's very interesting that you work for The Lawyer, which is a publication that is about what's up in the legal business, right? What's up in the
Yep.
legal industry or whatever. But you did not take up law. And
No.
I remember growing up, shit, childhood, right? I remember when
Reminiscing back in the old days.
back in the old days, we were we both wanted to be lawyers, right?
Yeah.
Did I get that right? So
Yep.
how is it a struggle for you, like adjusting? Yeah, and because writing about the law isn't really a popular thing unless you have a law degree here in the Philippines. Although some people
Mhm.
like Lian Buan from Rappler wants to go away with that. I think she's taking up like a master's in law, even though she's not a lawyer. So, can you tell me a little bit about your experience there?
Interestingly, so I did bring that up in my interview when I was applying for the job that I was almost a lawyer, and then I decided that I didn't want to do that. Maybe I enjoy having free time, and I
It's not for
learned.
me.
Now you can do work a week's worth of work in a day, clearly, so you should be okay. No, but like our editorial team at The Lawyer is made up of mostly people who do not have a background in law, actually.
Oh,
So yeah, no. So maybe out of the 15-ish people on our team, there's two people that came from a legal background and then jumped ship and decided to be journalists instead. Most of us are people who did degrees that were never going to get you a job. So philosophy and medieval history and like creative writing. I think that's the general profile of someone who turns into a journalist. The interest in law, I think everyone had some kind of passive interest in law before joining the team, so I'm not an exception to that. But you're not wrong. It's definitely a difficult industry to know anything about unless you have some sort of background on it. But that's also what everyone has told me since joining, that you're not going to know anything that's going on first. But like the debate community, you don't know anyone or anything that's going on when you first join. And then about a year later, those are like your best friends in the world. And you're just swapping secrets. You know all the names, all the drama.
no, no
So I'm building
drama.
a good point that this, yeah, I miss debate drama. I really do.
It's actually so funny hearing about debate drama now because it's obviously I don't want to invalidate anybody's feelings. So at the same time, it's like you're a child. Like, this is
Yeah.
most of the
Yeah.
time, right? There are some that are really quite serious. Most other times, they're just like they're
No, the drama is serious, and I would argue as a journalist that means that it's worth talking about because there are issues in there that you need to unpack. And especially for debaters, I think that's you're a section of people that should be able to work out issues like that. We always talk about how we think debaters are so good at conflict resolution. So while we amass a lot of drama, I think that we also take action on that quite well.
I have some stuff to tell you, but not right now.
Not
Uh,
now, we'll save it for later.
but yeah, you actually sent me like a PowerPoint about a lecture that you didn't get to do because recording a lecture on your own is like a terrible,
It's
miserable
it's
experience. It's a
no
miserable.
one to talk to. Yeah.
And one of the things that stood out to me was this concept of the fourth estate because you were talking about media as the fourth estate. The first thing that kind of messed me up there was growing up, I always thought, yeah, it is the fourth estate. And the other three estates are like the executive, legislative, and the judicial branches of the government. And Literally only yesterday did I find out that the other three estates are actually like the government, the church, and the masons. So can you please tell me about these different estates and what media has to do with any of them?
Yeah, no, so first of all, you weren't wrong to identify legislative, executive, and judiciary. That is what we get taught in school. But those are like the way that the government is divided. And the government encompasses an entire estate on its own. So the concept of firstly, the concept of the first three estates, I think came from France in the 17th century, where to talk about what was originally the three C's. So it used to be the crown, the church, and the commoner. And now most of us as a society, we don't have a crown anymore, so that just
Where
turned
you're
in
at, there is still a
where
crown.
I'm at, we have a crown, but they don't even it's still they're still not really one of the estates here. They're not necessarily making decisions. So it's still yeah, the three estates now are the government, the masses, and the church. So by estates, that really just means different bodies that dictate how societies function. And yeah, traditionally, there's a division between the church and state because we know that those are the two influential forces. The concept of the fourth estate is a little bit newer. That comes from an Irish politician slash philosopher slash economist named Edmund Burke, who first started talking about the media as the fourth estate, which is basically it's a separate regulating body that actually acts as the watchdog of society. So the point of having a fourth estate is to check and balance what the churches are doing and what the people are doing and what the government is doing by listening in, just being present, taking in all of that information, and then they are in the position to decide what information is important for everyone to know about. What do we need to know that our government is doing? What do we need to know is the drama going on behind our churches? And they get to decide what information is important so that people can make decisions for themselves in their everyday lives. So that's really the purpose of the fourth estate. Now, when the way that gets a little bit more complicated is that some may argue that the real purpose of a fourth estate is just it'll tell you what new policies are put in place. It'll tell you when I don't know, when churches are going to have different demonstrations, and these are need to know information. But some may say that public information also includes things like entertainment. So, celebrity gossip, next dates for the biggest concert going on. Some might say that the media is also a responsibility to talk about news that people want to hear rather than just what they need to do to operate as a society because entertainment is part of the social fabric. And I think it's very interesting for any media debate to just start with what the role is of the fourth estate of the media with regards to the motion. Like you could have an entire 2-hour debate just on the definition of the media and the fourth estate, honestly.
Okay, so the media gets to decide what to talk about. So does that also mean that to some extent they get to decide what are the things that people should or ought to care about? You might not be caring about, let's say, gossip, but I will give you so much gossip. You'll be like, ah, man, just by osmosis, I know about Taylor Swift and Matt Healy. This whole agenda
That
setting
you know
thing.
that joke on Twitter that's always like everything I know about Megan Fox and MJK's relationship I learned against my will. That's an example of the media just controlling what you're exposed to and what you think is important. Social
So
media, that's a whole other we can get to that later.
yeah. So you mentioned that there is a debate about what media is supposed to show, right? Like one side of it is saying we should only talk about the other three estates because the purpose of media as the fourth estate is to give some sort of balancing mechanism for these other estates. On the other hand, there might be some grayer areas, again, celebrity gossip or I don't know, pretty Grimes tweets about Elon Musk's penis or something. Oh my God. There are minors here.
What did you think of the new Spider-Verse movie? All this
Yeah.
stuff, so I can't wait to
Yeah.
Spider-Verse 2.
Film
That's
analysis.
cool.
I think this goes neatly into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is this idea of privacy, right? Because we obviously know that the media is supposed to report things that are part of the public sphere or should be part of like public information. But what is that anyway? What is it as a concept? How do we draw the line between what is public and something that journalists can talk about and what is private that they can't talk about? So, for example, you work for The Lawyer, which is a publication. Here we have abogado.com who took some of my tweets without my consent and my personal details. Well, can they do that? Is that a violation of my privacy, or is that something that they have the right to do as like they're just reporting on something that might be part of the public sphere? So
Oh
what is
no.
it?
We'll start with your tweet. Is it a problem if journalists take your tweets without your consent? No, no, it's not, because technically at that point you've published it yourself. When
Oh,
you tweet some, yeah, no, you already put it in the universe. It's out. It's public information. For journalists, public information is fair game. So that, so yeah, if you put the information out there, that probably doesn't count as protecting
okay.
your privacy. Maybe a little bit grayer if you're in like a private locked account or something, but even then, it's online and social media is the Wild West. And if you're trying to win the argument that what you post online should just belong to you, I think you might lose that argument.
People have tried to do that and they have lost.
Yeah.
In fact,
Yeah,
like,
exactly. It's not a strong one. If you don't want people to know, then don't post about it. But so what constitutes private information then? Yeah, that's a little bit trickier. I think it's easier to say that information is private if you're a private citizen. You have an average Joe day job where you work in an office or you work as a public servant. Nobody really expects details about your personal life to be published in the media in any way. So I think, and so things that you do in your own home, how that your dynamic with your family, your relationship with your parents, that sort of stuff. That's standard private information. It gets debatable when you start talking about public figures. So again, I always think talking about celebrity gossip is spicy. It is a debatable space because these are public figures. To some extent, they have consented to living a life where paparazzi is going to follow you around and find out what you've had for lunch. And here, I did warn Kyle that I might have a lot of England specific examples because that's where I live. But yeah, the royal family. Actually, they've played a big role in how media law has been shaped in Europe. So not just the royal family in the UK, like the Hanovers in Germany as well. Just like royals are the epitome of you are there to be an ornament, you are there to be someone that people in society can look at. So that's always the argument that sort of tabloids and paparazzi will go for when you start following these people around with a camera.
has
Again,
there been
that's
like,
another.
has
Mm.
there been like a situation where the media reported on something that a royal person did and they were, no, I don't like that. Us, well, I don't like that. And then they
Yeah.
accidentally
So
change the face of
yes.
like media.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So again, this is a princess in Germany. I forget her first name, but it was the Hanover family. So the princess went on like a ski trip and the paparazzi was taking pictures of her and her family and they got posted on the papers the next day. And that's what she brought that to court. She said that was an invasion of her privacy. I do think before that, the media law was a lot more lenient towards journalists. I think in the West in particularly, uh, journalists have the upper hand in what counts as public information. So laws that slowly start to make private lives more private have trickled in over the years because the assumption before anything else was public information is fair game. So yeah, it's Hanover Princess. She did win her claim. She won that the pictures of her family had to be taken down.
Oh,
It helped that there were children in the pictures, and posting children without the consent of their parents or the child's big no.
because it's like
It's the child.
presumably.
Yeah. Yeah. But also, what was allowed was they were allowed to write about it. They just weren't allowed to show any pictures of it. the public and what was fair game was that she went on a ski trip, but details of what she did, not as much. Pictures, definitely not. So again, that's another example of how you would be able to balance that kind of private information. I think another key example, this one's not a royal, but it's here. I think it was Naomi Campbell. I think this was in the early 2000s. She was in rehab for drug abuse. And then paparazzi was taking pictures of her coming out of her AA meetings and publicizing, "Oh, look, she has a drug addiction. Oh, she's in rehab, she's in therapy." Now, the reason that it was such a controversial case is because she had been previously asked in interviews if she was big on using drugs. And she said, "No, absolutely, totally clean." So that was a lie. Clearly, she did have a problem with drug addiction. So in that case, the conclusion, it was basically, the media have a right to publicize that she was in rehab. So lines had to be drawn there about what they could and couldn't say. So again, fair game was to say Naomi Campbell had a drug addiction and now she's in rehab. That's all the media should have been allowed to say. What was not fair game was to take pictures of her at her AA meeting because that's an invasion of her privacy. You now know where she goes for her AA meetings. That also compromises everybody else who was in rehab at the time. Wasn't fair game to give any details about the sort of drugs that she might have been on or what kind of basically any kind of details about the therapy that she was undergoing. That was not. You see, there's a division there. The reason that if they were allowed to publish just the details that she was in rehab was because her position as a public figure meant that her fans and the people had the right to know that this is a person that I look up to. You need to have the information, the basic information, of whether or not they're a user of drugs to decide if you want to still look up to them and put them on the same pedestal that you would. So as long as it gives the public just enough for them to know how they should or shouldn't feel about a public figure, that probably counts as public information. But there is going too far over the line.
Okay, so my question there is it's a bit weird to me because so the written word is fine, right? The written word is, oh, this public figure does drugs and they went to an AA meeting. That's fine. But photos are not. So
Mhm.
let's suppose that the photo was just her alone going out of an AA meeting and no one else was in that photo. It's just her. Would that be fair game?
Yeah, no, it's still unnecessary. You don't need a photo to know that she's come out of an AA meeting.
But it's the same.
And
Yeah, but it's the same
unnecessary.
thing, right? Like it's
I
communicating the same thing. Just
was
going from the idea that a picture tells 1,000 words. What if it was just the photo and there wasn't any accompanying article about it?
that would be worse, I would argue, because that leaves a lot of room for speculation about what she's doing in the photo. The words are more concrete. The words are telling you what's going on. I think that for the photo, that's even if it's just her and there's no one around her, and you try to make that the scene setting as neutral as possible, a photo still risks that you know where she is, what she would look like if she was coming out of an AA meeting. So if you saw her on the street looking like that, then like you could point out, oh, that's Naomi Campbell. That's the point. That's why it's too much.
So it would be like, what is the least intrusive from the point of view of the public figure? What's the least intrusive way to
Yeah,
communicate
exactly.
this information to the public? All right. Because you were talking about royals, right? We do have like parallel jurisprudence here in the Philippines where someone who is basically royalty was complaining that they should not have a movie made about them. So there goes some sort of royalty. It's Juan Ponce Enrile, okay? Still alive. A bunch of
That's
filmmakers were trying to
that's
make a
so funny.
documentary. They're trying to make a documentary about, I think it was just EDSA in general. And
Yep.
Juan Ponce Enrile was a key figure in the
Yep.
EDSA revolution. So, of course, footage of him was part of the documentary.
Yep.
And he was saying that this is a violation of my privacy. These are images that involve my
Mhm.
face and my personal dealings. And the Supreme Court said that you're a public figure. You're literally part of this like country shaping event. But based on the test that we just discovered earlier, which is like, what is the least intrusive way to communicate this information? Wouldn't it be arguable for Juan Ponce Enrile to have said that there are many different ways of communicating the same thing without resorting to using images of me on film?
I think the difference there is again on the spectrum of who is a private figure and a public figure. Sure, I don't know if it's accurate to compare. Actually, no, I take that back. Juan Enrique Ponce would be comparable to a royal. He wouldn't be comparable to a celebrity. A celebrity's private life is probably more of a gray area than
Mm,
that of a politician or someone in the royal family because basically their job is to be an influential figure. A
and to be
celebrity's
ethical as
job,
well, right?
yeah, exactly. A celebrity's job is not to have you look up to them. That's just something that happens coincidentally. But if you are in a position where you're literally politicians are the definition of a public figure. So for him to say that he doesn't want a documentary being made of his life, especially at a time that was so significant to the entire country and the people there. No, I still think he would lose out on that because it just in a matter of weighing who if the private right outweighs the public, it doesn't, not in this case.
So
So,
yeah, there is definitely a spectrum I can see where
only, yeah.
yeah. So because like when I'm thinking about public figure, I just go, you're either a public figure or you're not a public figure. But in reality, there are just like major public figures and very public figures. But that leads you to the next question I have about public figures, which
Yeah.
is what is the line? What is the standard that you must meet in order for you to be considered a public figure? Because you, we are in the age of social media.
Oh god,
Where,
here we
like a
go.
person can have a person can have so much influence on a lot of different people and have like hundreds of thousands of followers on social
Mhm.
media, more followers than actual celebrities. But would they be considered public figures? Like, how many followers does one need to
It
have
doesn't
in
take
order to be like, when do I know that I give up my right to privacy?
No, again, at this point, I don't think we're talking when it's about social media, it's less about being a public figure and more about the fact that you are on a public platform. So you can be a private individual, but as soon as you post it, as soon as it's out there, then at that point, if people want to talk about it and rip you to shreds over it, it's probably not the kindest thing to do, and it's debatable whether or not people have the sanity to cope with the backlash that comes with just being on social media. But I still stand by it. And anything you do on social media, and this is just life advice now.
It's just life
Um,
advice. Like,
it's
stop.
just life advice.
Yeah.
If anything that you put on social media, even in a private account, it's dangerous. Social media is definitely a form of me. We haven't had it long enough, and people don't understand it enough to have properly regulated it yet. But yeah, just to give an answer on social media in general, I would just say doesn't matter who you are and what you've said. If it's on social media, then sorry,
It's part of public.
it's part of the public.
But what if the reason why I wanted to ask this is the most recent book that I finished reading
Mm,
is This Is How You Lose the Time War. So do you know what happened here?
no,
Wait.
summarize it for us, Karen.
Okay. There is this book, This Is How You Lose the Time War. It won a lot of awards, but didn't get a lot of sales, relatively speaking. And then all of a sudden it went to the top charts in like the Amazon bestsellers list. And you can
Mm,
trace that to one Twitter user just saying, quote retweeting with a photo of the cover saying, please read this, right? Go into it blind, just read it. And everyone started sharing it. And it got me to buy it. It got me to read it,
mm.
finished it in a couple of days. And it actually messed me up pretty bad. It
Oh
is good.
god.
Please read it. It is that good.
Oh,
Or
it's literally just like a storybook. I was out here thinking it was something that taught you some big political lesson.
it taught me a lot of things. stares off into the distance. But yeah, like this Twitter user doesn't go by their real name on Twitter, but they have had a huge impact on the publishing industry. And
Mhm.
even publishers at some of their events, like Nebula, discuss them and they're like, maybe we can all be like this Twitter user for each other. But they
Yeah.
don't go by their real name on Twitter. Their name on Twitter is Bigulus Diculus. So everyone's just going, oh, thank you, Bigulus Diculus. So I'm thinking like, if someone goes, oh, this person is actually a registered sex offender, and I'm not saying that they are, I'm saying like, what if someone releases information about this person? Would they be able to say that that's an invasion of my privacy and I did not consent to it? Like, I'm not a public figure, even though I have influenced thousands of people to buy a book. I've influenced a lot of people to do something. I am an influencer, but I'm still not a public figure.
I think because so the information coming to light here is that he has a criminal offense. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if crime is involved, that again is information that the public needs to have.
Okay.
And regardless of
How about not necessarily a crime, but icky? Oh, not a crime, but still icky. Like they used a racial slur 10 years ago, something like that.
yeah, that's I would argue that's not public information. If he did something sketchy, but it's not illegal, it's not detrimental to society, he's not a figure that that you consider dangerous, then yes, I think that much is private. But again, that's just me. I think there are more news hungry journalists out there who will argue that if it makes a story, then it's worth publishing. It's out there. He used a racial slur. We learned about it. It's not private, so we can say it. It's so broad. And that's what I was saying to you earlier that you could argue forever what information should be private or public because there will always be an argument for either side.
Yeah. And I feel like this is where I want to ask you, what's your biggest frustration with how debaters deal with media debates?
Yeah. So before recording, we had touched on it as well. I would say that the biggest mistake that a debater can make is to assume that everything, all the matter that they've taken in on the news is just information that they should absorb so they can regurgitate it in a debate. I think that's the worst way that it's bad to use in media debates. And it's also just bad for critical thinking in general, I would say. So when it comes to analyzing how the news media works, I think it's very easy, especially for, let's say, our generation in leaning more towards like left liberal values. It's easy to look at Rappler is a good guy. The, what else are good guys? The Guardian is a good guy. And then the bad guys would be maybe the Manila Bulletin is a little bit more right leaning. Or here would be like the Telegraph or the Daily Mail. So you just divide these publications by which ones are good and which ones are bad, which is it's super reductive of what the story an editor is actually trying to tell you. So in the presentation that I sent Kyle, I had a few examples that I thought would be relevant to talk about. So I think we should start with Rappler because I think for a debater, that's a very go-to source. Maria Ressa, she's relatively a trustworthy figure. She's highly respected as a journalist on a global scale. But when you dig a little bit more about what Rappler actually is, and she had conceptualized the publication because she wanted to make a newspaper that would cater to people in the time of social media. So the way that the website is laid out and the way that the stories are written, they'll be in more bulleted short forms. They'll be cut up with different pictures just so that text can be more accessible on a screen. The headlines need to be pithy enough for people to want to click when they see them on Twitter. It's very much a publication that's supposed to be intertwined with social media. And when you think of it like that, you can read it more from the lens of you can critique it from the lens of someone who knows that it's not there to give you hard, long news that you want to analyze for hours and hours. It's meant for a reader of social media. And those typically need to be digested quicker. So that's Rappler for an example. Another example is the Inquirer. I bring up the Inquirer because it is what we would call the Philippines' newspaper of record. And basically every country has a newspaper of record. They that basically means the paper that on a global scale is considered the most quote unquote reliable source of information to figure out what's going on in different countries. So that the Inquirer is considered an objective source. It's probably not going to give you a lot of opinion back and forth. That's an example of a paper that's just throwing information at you and then do what you will with it. But yeah, you need to be able to critique whether or not it's an accurate depiction of how the country operates because that's what it's supposed to be. So knowing that much about it teaches you what kind of information you should expect. Now, I think the most controversial one that I wanted to talk about is the BBC, because the BBC is a newspaper that is, again, we're using an English example at this point. It's regulated by the government. Now, we learned earlier that the fourth estate is supposed to be independent of the other three estates. You're regulating them, they can't regulate you. And people will say that the BBC is almost a form of propaganda for the British government. They will never say anything bad about the royal family on the BBC.
Oh,
For
there's the
example,
dot?
they don't, they can't.
Oh,
Yeah. Now, the reason that it's debatable is because I would still say that the BBC is a reliable news source. It's not flowering anything up. It's definitely not propaganda to the extent of worshiping the royal family or worshiping the British government. Nothing like that. It'll still criticize the government when need be. But typically if there's bad news on the horizon for either of those big institutions, they'll just downplay it there, I would say. Now, what else could I say? Oh, matter that I wanted to give. So the BBC was recently in this scandal over their chairman. His name is Richard Sharp. His name is Richard Sharp. Richard was appointed. The way that you pick the chairman of the BBC is that basically the prime minister gets to choose. That's how intertwined the publication is with just like the government institution. And it was a few months ago they found out that while he was in the running for the chair position, he had been involved with getting the prime minister at the time, Boris Johnson, a loan of £800,000. He didn't give him the money, but he facilitated the transaction. And that's a conflict of interest. So he's actually recently resigned. I think he resigned a few weeks ago over that scandal. But that's an example of when you realize who's pulling the strings at the BC, it makes you more wary of just because they're not saying anything bad about the royal family here doesn't mean that anything wrong is actually going on. No, these are again background points that you need to be aware of so you can be critical of the news sources that you're reading.
yeah. So the general frustration here is a lot of the time you have preferred news sources like Rappler, and when we were younger, it was also The Economist, right? Insofar as you might consider them part of quote unquote the media,
Absolutely.
debaters just eat that stuff up.
Yeah.
When
I also think, oh, sorry, on the other side of that, I think you sleep on publications that are more tabloidy when in Manila is more, or BuzzFeed, or
oh damn
where's it?
BuzzFeed. I feel
BuzzFeed. You
like
remember BuzzFeed?
no,
The
I was
thing is,
saying that didn't like people hate on BuzzFeed News a lot, but
yeah,
I know, right? They have made like some hard hitting award winning journalism in the past.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Again, when you're able to analyze news sources critically, that really opens the doors for you to start reading other news sources. Because it's important to know what's happening in tabloids just because it is information that is definitely in the public. It's definitely selling. So if you don't know what's going on in the mind of the reader of someone who follows BuzzFeed religiously, then you're missing an entire narrative that's definitely in the public sphere. And you can't fully critique it and talk about the culture behind it unless you're reading that as well. So to get an actual holistic view, I think, of the news and media debates, I think it's very helpful to be reading a diverse set of news sources, all of them critically, but yeah, it'll show you the perspective of different people who are like writing the news and curating stories. All stories that you will ever read on the news are curated in some way. There's always an editor that is trying to make the angle sound most like the angle that would be used in the voice of this paper. So you have to be able to identify that voice, and then you can properly talk about it in a debate, I think.
So, just to be clear, are you endorsing this view of whenever you're reading a news source, you also have to take into consideration the person or persons who are like reporting the news and what are their interests and stuff?
100%. As a journalist myself, I know that we need everything that you read in the news needs to be taken as a grain with a grain of salt because like a lot of the things that I write about, I won't know anything about them until maybe a week before I've written the article. So having that much and knowing that what you read me saying is not the end all and be all of information.
Yeah,
It,
but
it- yeah.
yeah, that's interesting. And I think on this note, I'd like to say that one of like the balms that I have, it's a balm for my soul in this regard is Ground News, which is an app that like shows you how different news publications are reporting on the same issue. And it shows you like,
Oh,
oh, yeah, so it's an app. And I wish we were sponsored by it, but we're not.
what? That's cool. I want that. I didn't have ground app, you say.
Yeah. For
Okay.
example, in Greece right now, there is a situation where there's 351 looted antiquities that will be returned to the authorities. So it also shows here like what percentage of these publications that are reporting on it are generally left leaning, right leaning, and centric.
Yep.
So for that issue, like you would expect you what ended up happening was only 20% of this coverage was from like right leaning sources and 40% comes from like left leaning sources. And this makes sense if it's about antiquities and stuff like that. If right wing news publications report on it, the next stuff would be hey, wait a minute. Shouldn't we have a conversation about how the UK just has a lot of antiquities and artifacts and stuff like that that they stole from different countries? Shouldn't these also be returned and stuff like that? So this makes sense. I'm so happy I could contribute to your life in this way. Like, yeah, ground up. But
Think?
I would like to balance it a little bit with my own frustration, which is I also feel like some debaters hyperfixate on the person or the agency or the corporation that reports the news, and they use it as a way to oh, let's ignore that. There are like, to be fair, the way that some news publications discuss the news not that great from my personal point of view, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's nothing there. So for example, like Fox News, I feel like people just generalize Fox News listeners, readers as like foaming at the mouth conservatives. But as a person who, just for research purposes, I promise, I swear, watch Tucker Carlson, right? I already
Yeah.
have a sense of there has to be a reason why people resonate with this person.
Yeah.
So I also want to take a look at, let's not discount, obviously, the personal interests of the people who are reporting the news. But beyond that, let's take a look at what exactly they are reporting as well. So that's my personal frustration with it. Am I
No, that's true. And I know you think that it's the other side of what I was saying, but I actually think that goes hand in hand with it. Like to listen to somebody like Tucker Carlson or go on Fox News at all and to feel like weird and ashamed about that. I don't think you should because it really does help you just understand better how why what other people are drawn to.
I really like listening and watching the conservative, pundits like the Daily
Mhm.
Wire, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, Candace Owens. Not because I like them, but it's fun for me as a debater to listen to
Mhm.
these people and just go, oh, this is how they're convincing others. These are the techniques
Yeah.
that they're using, right? I don't know, like maybe for people who are listening, maybe that's one way that you can use for training, I guess. Not necessarily just for debating. Although, to be fair, I think that if you're a debater, you can also stand to learn a lot about the way that they're packaging and framing some of these things. Because it is quite enlightening how just like the framing and agenda setting really does play a huge role in how
It
people
affects the
perceive
story
things.
so much. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I'm actively encouraging people to listen to Fox News now. Oh my god, this is such a bad look. Honestly. But
Sure.
I think
Don't
like
listen. Tune in. You don't have to actually listen to what they're saying and follow it. Following what everything that again, that's the opposite of what we're saying. We're saying be open to it. Don't mindlessly follow it. Don't equate listening to something new with mindlessly following what you've heard.
yeah, for sure. And I feel like the reason why it might be a bad look in the first place is this notion of they're not reliable. Why are you listening to them? So I think that's the next thing I wanted to ask you because I think everyone generally accepts in the debate community that there's no such thing as a completely objective journalist, and there's no such thing as completely objective journalism as well. And yet we do talk about things like reliability. So my question is, what even is reliability as a concept?
Okay. I think this goes into sort of the dissertation side of my presentation. So, when I was finishing my master's degree in journalism, I studied towards the end of my degree the different ways that publications in the West and the East were reporting about the Russia Ukraine war as it was unfolding in real time. And it was a question of reliability, was the main thing that I was trying to assess. When you're reporting news about one instance, all these different publications have a different angle on it. How do you decide which one is more reliable? Now, the papers that I had studied were one in England, so the Times, and one in China, which was called the People's Daily. Both of those are newspapers of record, which is why I chose them. Definitely reporting on the war very differently. A summary of that is basically that I found that the UK publication was very big on talking about the military strategy behind how the West was coming in to help. I also noticed that the paper kind of uses Western opinion and global opinion interchangeably. So that was one thing I felt was worth noting. And on the side of the People's Daily, there was so interestingly in China, propaganda is not thought of as a derogatory term when talking about the media or anything really. Their media is propaganda over there. And that's just agreed what it's supposed to be. So their reporting on the war was very much China staying out of it because we're past pacifists and we believe that the hegemons in the West and in Washington are fueling the flames to this war. So very different stories. And it was my job to assess which version was worth listening to. Now again, I am a believer that there's no such thing as a black and white, this paper is perfect and this one isn't. There's just the different critiques that you can give to both of them. And for less, not so surprisingly, I did conclude that the Times was the more reliable paper for that. But that was just because the method that I was using to analyze that was to look at if the paper was making a claim. So for the Times example, they're saying that peace talks don't work because we've already tried those in the past. And clearly, Putin's show of force means that he's only going to respond to a show of force as well. I considered that a relatively good argument for the reason that for this claim, talking about the positive outlook about prioritizing military strategy, you could quantify it with the proof that they were giving throughout the article. So as long as someone was trying to prove their attitude towards a specific topic they were talking about, I use that as a standard for they're probably more reliable. The on the converse, China had some interesting points, absolutely. I don't think it was inaccurate to say that there was some level of Western hegemony going on in the sense that, for example, everyone's talking about the Russia-Ukraine war, but there's hundreds of wars that go on throughout the course of human history throughout the world right now. Why is this the one that's getting so much attention? A different study, again, adjacent to mine, that a fellow student of mine was doing, found that Western publications in times of war reporting have a tendency to focus, like they will hound and report out of a war that involves someone in the West, particularly someone who is white. So, yeah, and that's a valid criticism, I would say, coming out from academics that the People's Daily had picked up on as well. So that was right. Still, I thought that it was a less reliable publication because it was a lot of declamation. So you will find papers, so like the People's Daily, I would say it's also probably true of Fox News is another probably broader, more accessible example. They make a lot of big claims about how the governments are trying to bring the world down into ashes. And it's a lot of like detrimental fear mongering, I would call it, without really saying anything about the actual situation to back up those claims. So I think that's another thing that you should be looking out for when you start reading the news. Whatever claim and opinion that the paper is taking, are they taking the time to show you the evidence as to why they have made this claim in the first place? Because there's really nothing stopping journalists from just saying what they want to say without proof of it at all. And that happens. It happens so often, even in publications that are considered reputable ones. Yeah, I think when you have that system in mind when you're critiquing the news, that's how you can decide which ones are reliable and which ones aren't.
So on one hand, you have this idea of, are you like arguing for something? Do you have an attitude when you're reporting on something? And on the other hand, you also have a spectrum of how much are you willing to argue using the facts of the matter at hand to justify your attitude, right? So both of them taken together
Exactly.
create this sense of reliability for you.
Absolutely. So I think there I don't think there's no such thing as objectivity in the news, but there are facts. Reporting on facts is not the same as telling a news story. So it's really about what you do with those facts and how you make the logical leaps between the facts that are presented to you. And some papers will do that better than others.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, maybe we can make like an alignment chart, like the left libertarian, right libertarian,
Yes.
left
The
authoritarian, left
the
authoritarian.
political compass.
Yeah, maybe we can make something like that, but for like reliability. You have people who just have vibes, like they have vibes, like they have an attitude.
Yeah.
And then if they have that
Mhm.
attitude very strongly, but they don't take the time to like research on it so much, and they like it's just vibes, and they don't take the time, energy, and effort to give you the facts that back up and justify those things. Or maybe they use like misleading statistics.
Ironically, I yeah.
That might
Ironically, I think
right.
I
Sorry,
think
go
the
ahead.
podcasts that tend to be guilty of that, funnily enough. It's very easy to just talk and everyone can have a podcast these days. So nobody really feels the need to ground what they're saying because it's easy to just give the vibes.
That's true. And vibes sell, right? Like
Vibes
that's what's
sell.
yeah.
Exactly. That's a whole other thing that we can talk about as well. As much as the media, in principle, has has an obligation to be the fourth estate in today's capitalist climate, a lot of journalists are also just trying to sell.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
We mentioned Maria Ressa earlier, and I
Yeah.
read her book, right? Like How to Stab the Dictator. I told you earlier that I have probably an unpopular opinion on this because I'm not particularly fond of that book. But one of the things that stood out to me was like this idea that it took a while for them to be profitable. And it made me realize that so many of these publishers, these publications, they have to resort to either asking for donations outright or putting it
Agree.
behind a paywall. So I do understand that the more likely you are to just focus on vibes, the more likely you are to succeed financially speaking, because it sells much easier.
Mhm.
First of all, on a shareability basis, the more vibes heavy it is, the more likely it is to be shared, especially if they're negative emotions, right? And that's the reason why, like, I maybe there's a debate here where maybe it could be like an actor motion or something where, as a progressive, donate more to quote unquote balanced, fair and balanced publications that are independent or whatever. Although that the more that you donate to them, the less likely it is that they're going to stay independent. I don't know. Maybe there's something
Yeah,
that
no.
don't know how to word
Yeah,
it.
no,
But
that's definitely true. When you put money into play there, when you figure out who is sponsoring a certain publication, that's definitely going to affect the type of news that they tell. For example, if we're talking about things like the BBC where it's government sponsored, whoever is keeping it afloat, they're probably less likely to say anything bad or anything at all about them. You leave them out of the conversation and it becomes easier for your funder to just live as they like. And on the vibe selling, I know this is true in the UK. I'll have to see if it's true elsewhere as well. But at least here, the biggest publications, at least the top three, are all tabloids. They sell the
then,
best. And in the journalism community, we have this whole thing that nobody really, as journalists, we won't look down on someone who's working for a publication that has a different political view as ours, because we all understand how hard it is to keep a paper afloat and to keep readers engaged. So for someone like me working at probably it's a more research driven, behind a paywall trade publication, I can look at someone from the Daily Mail and know that we are in the same boat. There's people who leave the lawyer and go to tabloids like the Daily Mail or the Telegraph or something. And that's just something that needs to happen because at that point, the people behind the news are just doing it to survive for their own jobs.
yeah. So in short, don't knock the hustle. But on that note,
No.
on that note, because some of it is really about the vibes, but ideally there's like a good mix of vibes and research and backing up whatever attitude it is that you're selling, whatever vibe it is that you're selling. But how much research is something worth celebrating? Like, for example, if you're going to argue on all the sides of a particular issue, does this, as part of your research, does that also mean that we might be able to celebrate it when, let's say, a journalist talks about, oh, this is why terrorists are doing, this is why they believe in the things that they do. And as a result, they might platform some of these more radical ideas. Like, on an ethical perspective, it's that something that we should celebrate. I understand it is debatable, but what's your take on this?
I You're right. It's very difficult because on a principled level, it's easier to say yes, absolutely. They should be able to do things like report on the side of a terrorist. A journalist should definitely have the right to report on every perspective. And to an extent, it's their job to find every perspective before making a claim. On the other hand, trying to assess how readers will take that information, that I think that's where the debate lies. Are we able to stick with the principle of freedom of press, or do we have to be careful about what the masses are going to take away from it? How much of the way that you write the news should be thoughtful of what your readers are going to get out of it? And is that even your responsibility? Can you even say that you are at a position to control it? So my position on it is yes, you should. Realistically, though, I actually don't think it's profitable for a publication to want. They don't want to piss off their readers. So that's another way that you could argue it. So there's the principled argument and then there's the practical argument, really. And they lie on different ends of the spectrum. So the truth is, in practice, I probably would avoid talking about the terrorist side, even if I believe that I should have the right to do so.
So it's not whether you can, but it's whether you should. That's the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I That's interesting to me because I feel like I've never thought about it from the perspective of media before. But for sure, I have thought about maybe it would be good from a national security point of view to understand why terrorist groups or terrorist ideologies are so attractive for some people so that maybe we can find better ways of dismantling that or solving it before, like, solving the push factors of organized
Yeah.
crime and whatever. So I think maybe you can argue a little bit. I'm not endorsing this view. I'm thinking like, oh my God, save me. uh,
Come
I
on,
think
don't do.
like there is space to argue that it's worth learning about so that you can, as a member of the public, you can also think about what you can do in your own community to help prevent the spread of radicalism and stuff like that.
Yeah. No, that's definitely true. And again, just I guess to wrap up that point, just talks about how when you put it on the onus of the journalist to consider what how the audience is going to take something away, it's difficult to do because you cannot control obviously how people are going to read something, especially because the world is so broad and everyone will take in information differently. For the point of national security, you also have to consider whether or not, and maybe this is a little bit cynical, you have to consider whether or not they're interested in continuing to find solutions to prevent terrorist groups from amassing, or if the real interest is really to just show strength and show that we are on the right side because we don't condone what these terrorist groups are doing. And again, those are both completely feasible angles for a media reporter to want to talk about, depending on what publication they work for, really.
Yeah. So I think we can wrap up this episode with that note, which is I think it's a bit emblematic of what it means to debate about the media, which is like there are so many things that you juggle, right? When you're a critical person who's like consuming the news, it's not just like what it is that's being said, but also the things that are not being said. What are the intentions? Who are the people who are saying this? But you also need to have a balance of, okay, let's analyze the exact thing that you're saying as well. And what I can take
Mhm.
away from that as a listener or a viewer. So I guess on that point as well, for people who are listening to this, take what we say here with a grain of salt, consume all of the episodes
Exactly.
of this podcast, consume it for you, right? Just because Kyle
Yeah,
said
be
it
critical of
or
both of
Kyle says
us.
it. Yeah, be critical thinker, everyone. And on that note, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Thank you so much, Carla. It's been amazing getting to catch up with you before the recording and also talking to you about media in general. And for everyone else, we'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye.